Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Caster here. Welcome back. I wanted to make sure that I uploaded it today just because I figured you guys would probably watch it today and just have it ready. So again, this is taking a look at the antebellum through Civil War period, just kind of going through some of the main things. And then in class, we will look at the Reconstruction period with chapter 22. So one of the very first things, right, is just kind of looking through some of the important pieces of information, some of the important people. So again, we have Harriet Beecher Stowe. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, we all know, abolitionist, right? She's from Connecticut. Her father, Second Great Awakening preacher, very much involved in some of the stuff that was going on. Of course, she becomes very famous because she writes the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin really awakens sort of the moral fabric of the North. The novel itself, right, focused on, one of the big things that it focused on was the separation of the slave family. So it becomes very important in terms of awakening the social fabric of the North. So again, the book, right, so written in 1852, okay, so considered abolitionist literature, focused on the horrors of separating the slave families, focused on the relationship between the house and the field slaves. So again, this term becomes very popular, right? Uncle Tom. In class, we'll talk a little bit about this term, Uncle Tom, in relation to when we say things like whitewashed or acting black. Like, what does that mean? And so again, it's considered one of the social causes of the Civil War, this book. Another thing that's really important, right, obviously, is the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. It was part of the Compromise of 1850. The South wanted a stricter fugitive slave law. Again, the idea was to force Northerners to return the runaway slaves. However, the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, written 2 years after, right, because people began reading it, because they realized the consequence of sending people back, many people in the North began to not follow the fugitive slave law. That was a part of the Compromise of 1850. Because their social conscience was awakened by Uncle Tom's Cabin and other things that were happening too. This is another really important author and important book, but this time written by a Southerner. So this man, Hinton R. Helper, he wrote a book called The Impending Crises of the South. And again, he is a Southerner, he's from North Carolina. He argued that slavery was economically bad for poor whites, that it actually was not in their best self-interest that slavery continued because they would never be able to compete with free labor. And that's a really important thing. His book, along with Uncle Tom's Cabin, is actually going to be banned in the South. So again, here's the book. It was written in 1857. It is not considered abolitionist literature because it was not written from a social conscience perspective. It is written from an economic perspective in terms of being a Southerner. And again, like I said, it was banned in the South. Again, one of the things that we had talked about prior to the break too was the idea of popular sovereignty and how important it's going to become. It was presented by General Lewis Cass. Again, the idea was that people of states should have self-determination when it comes to slavery. Again, the 1820 Missouri Compromise, right? With that, the federal government began to decide on whether or not slaves would a state would be included as a slave state or a free state. So again, the idea was with popular sovereignty that the burden would be taken away from the federal government. The pro-slavery forces really liked it because they predicted that it would actually lead to the growth of slave states. So as a result of the compromise of the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act that we had talked about prior to the break, what ended up happening was pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces began moving into Kansas. And they began to essentially try to get numbers in there to try to get Kansas to become either a pro-slavery or an anti-slave or a free state. And what this is going to result in is actual physical contact or confrontation between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery forces. And this is going to come to a culmination on May 21st, 1856, where pro-slavery activists, they actually ransacked the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, Kansas. There was one fatality of a pro-slavery activist when part of a building fell on him. But even though there wasn't like massive death, because this happened, because there was physical harm that was trying to be done by pro-slavery forces against anti-slavery forces, it's going to result in violence in Kansas. This violence is going to come probably to an even greater height with John Brown. So again, John Brown, right, white abolitionist, believed in armed insurrection. So he believed that anti-slavery forces should actually use the hand, right, the gun, the rifle, to actually tear down slavery. And as a result of what happened at Lawrence, Kansas, he decided to enact revenge on the pro-slavery forces. So in an area where it was very heavily pro-slavery in Kansas, a place called Potawatomi Creek in Kansas, John Brown, along with a few of his people, including his sons, they actually massacred or killed 5 slavery supporters. Later in 1859, he's going to also be responsible for the raid on Harper's Ferry, but we'll get to that later on. But as a result of this conflict that was happening and the bloodshed that had happened in Kansas, Kansas is going to earn the nickname Bleeding Kansas. Okay, so again, May 24th through the 25th, 1856, part of Bleeding Kansas. Again, John Brown is responsible. Again, it was in response to the sacking of Lawrence. And again, 5 pro-slavery people were murdered by John Brown. So again, he's sort of a wanted man. So again, like I told you guys, this results in what's called Bleeding Kansas. It was a nickname given to Kansas because of the bloodshed that took place between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Again, the sack of Lawrence and the Potawatomi Massacre. Results of popular sovereignty of Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And again, all of this overturned the Missouri Compromise, or at least the part of the Missouri Compromise that restricted slave states from being formed above the 36th line of parallel, and that the federal government would actually be stripped of that burden. So one of the things that emerged during this time also is a new political party, right, the Free Soilers. So between 1848 and 1852, so a lot of anti-slavery members of the Whigs, anti-slavery members of the Democrats, they were against slavery in the new territories for economic, social, and political reasons. They became part of the Free Soilers. So the Free Soil Party were people who, again, were in favor of the new territories being against slavery, but again, not all before abolitionist or social reasons. So one of the things that happened as a result of all these things, right, again, going back to Kansas, is Kansas had all kinds of different constitutions that were proposed, 4 of them. Probably the most controversial and most famous is the Lecompton Constitution. And so in response to anti-slavery Topeka Constitution, so they had actually set up a Capitol building. The pro-slavery forces had actually set up a pro-slavery Capitol in Lecompton, and the anti-slavery forces that set up a Capitol in Topeka. So they presented different constitutions. The pro-slavery forces said that their constitution, or the Lecompton Constitution, was based on popular sovereignty. And basically what they said was that the Lecompton Constitution was popular sovereignty because it was going to allow the people of Kansas to choose. But here's what the Constitution said. They said if the people of Kansas voted for Kansas to be a pro-slavery state, then that's what it would be. It would be a pro-slavery state based on popular sovereignty. But if the people voted for Kansas to be a free state, that the people that were already there who had slaves would continue to be allowed to have those slaves. So in other words, slavery would be allowed to continue to exist in Kansas, even though the people of Kansas said that it would be a free state. So the Lecompton Constitution becomes very controversial. It was rejected, but again, it continued to heat the debate over slavery. Stephen Douglas, the Democrat, right, so from Illinois, who is a huge advocate for popular sovereignty, was actually against the Lecompton Constitution because he said that it was not a true example of popular sovereignty. When he commented on this, it actually angered a lot of Democrats, and he actually helps split the Democrats because of his commentary on the Lecompton Constitution. So here's Stephen Douglas, right? He's a senator from Illinois, wrote the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He was actually a huge railroad promoter. Again, believed in popular sovereignty. He angered the Democrats over the Lecompton Constitution. And he, we'll talk about this a little bit, he debated Lincoln in a series of debates in Illinois for the 1858 congressional seat. And one of the things that becomes really important with him, too, is something called the Freeport Doctrine, which is part of the debates. So James Buchanan is the 15th president of the United States. He was president from 1857 to 1861. He tried to maintain a balance of power. He's considered by many sort of a weak president. He was a slave owner himself. He was the president of the United States during the Dred Scott decision, and he's also the president of the United States when South Carolina seceded from the Union, and he did very little to stop it from happening. So Charles Sumner, abolitionist congressman, he's the one who gave the 2-day speech denouncing the South for what he called crimes against humanity. He singled out the senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler, in his speech. Andrew Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, also from South Carolina, showed up the next day and beat Charles Sumner with a cane. And again, one of the things that actually happens, right, is that he doesn't stop beating him until the cane actually broke, resulting in many Southern congressmen showering Preston Brooks with brand new canes. So again, Andrew Butler, right, he's a senator from South Carolina, pro-slavery. He co-authored the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And again, he was the target of Charles Sumner's speech. And again, Preston Brooks, congressman from South Carolina, pro-slavery, and he's the one that severely beat Charles Sumner. Then this bombshell, right, 1857. So Dred Scott was a black man who actually sued for his freedom. So he was taken up into Illinois and Wisconsin, which were free. His slave owner died, and so because he was taken up into free areas, Dred Scott basically said that he was a free man. And he was from Missouri. The slave owner's wife claimed that Dred Scott needed to come back because he was her property. So Dred Scott sued in Missouri court. Missouri court agreed with the slave owner's wife, and so it was taken up all the way to the to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled, first of all, that Dred Scott was not a human being, and because he was not a human being, that the case should not have even been heard by the Supreme Court. So again, ruling that these Africans are actually property. Another thing that the Supreme Court ruled was that the federal government actually had no power to decide on the issue of slavery, and that they should not have made a decision. And they actually ruled that the Missouri Compromise itself was unconstitutional because the federal government did not have the power to actually ban slavery from happening in above the 36th parallel. Then there was a panic that hit, an economic panic, so a financial panic that occurred because of over-speculation in land and railroad contracts. So they began building too many railroads, began expanding into too much land. It hit the North very hard. The South had become so economically self-sufficient, and they were not affected very much by the Panic of 1857. This becomes really important because it actually makes the South very overconfident. So the Homestead Act of 1860, it was the 1860 bill, was actually pushed very much by the Free Soilers. It would have provided federal land grants to Western settlers. It was actually passed by Congress, but it was vetoed by Democratic President James Buchanan. Eventually, because so many Democrats left the Union, the Homestead Act was actually able to be passed in 1862. It was ratified by an almost Republican Congress. Then, in 1858, the Illinois congressional debates happened between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. There were 7 debates. The Freeport one is the most important. So Freeport is actually a city in Illinois. So the Freeport Doctrine made Douglas look bad with the Democrats. It actually will cost him a lot of people believe that it helped cost him the election of 1860. And so what happened at Freeport was Lincoln actually asked Stephen Douglas about like the Lee-Compton Constitution and the Dred Scott decision. And so essentially what Lincoln asked him was, look, so the Supreme Court has ruled that the federal government has no say when it comes to slavery. And so what do you think about this decision? And so what he said, his response was, look, again, I believe in popular sovereignty. So if the people of the state rule that the state is going to have slaves, then that's fine. But if the people of the state also decide that they're not going to have slaves, then that's also okay too. When he makes this comment, he is going to anger a lot of pro-slavery Democrats because they were hoping that he would just stay quiet on the issue. because the federal government, through the Supreme Court, has already made a decision, and here he is commenting on the decision. Again, like I was saying, this is the Freeport Doctrine took place in Freeport, Illinois. Again, Lincoln challenged Douglas regarding the Kansas-Nebraska Act under the Dred Scott decision. So again, Douglas's response that people could still vote slavery down in the territory, right? Again, it will help alienate Douglas from the Democrats. So then, in October of 1859, John Brown attempted to create a slave revolt by seizing the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It failed, and Brown was arrested, and he was hung. The person who actually did the arresting was Robert E. Lee. And in his sort of like his last speech, John Brown condemned the situation, and again sort of becomes sort of a martyr. So it raises this question about John Brown, right? Whether or not he was a martyr or a murderer. Ralph Waldo Emerson actually will call him sort of Jesus-like because he says he was a martyr for trying to end slavery. So the idea, a nickname emerges for Southern Democrats who were very much trying to rally the troops in terms of, nullification and secession, and so they become known as the Southern Fire Eaters. So in reference to the group of pro-slavery extremists, right? So again, from the South, they eventually urge the separation of Southern states into a new nation, and again, they become the secessionists. So election of 1860, the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln. The Democrats nominated both Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge because they could not agree. So sort of Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, and John Breckinridge was nominated in the South. The main issue of the election of 1860 becomes slavery. Lincoln will win, and he was not on the ballot. On almost all of the southern states, he was not even on the ballot. So he wins the majority of the electoral votes. And again, it just goes to show the power of the population in the North. But as a result of the election of 1860 and Lincoln being elected, for many Southerners, this is the last straw, and so it is the spark of secession. So South Carolina, on December 20th, 1860, they are the first of the states to secede. And again, if you think about it, right, historically, a lot of the stuff that we had already been talking about, if you think back to like the Tariff of Abominations, and if you think back to the South Carolina exposition that was written, right, it makes sense that South Carolina, they also had the majority, they had the most slaves out of all of the states in the South. So December 20th, 1860, 5 days before Christmas, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union. Caused a chain reaction in February of 1861. Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas will join. So the 7 Confederate States of America. So for some reason on this, it didn't show up. But what it was a slide that would have said Confederate States of America. But it is actually in your notes. It is the official name of the secessionist states. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi is actually going to be elected the president. The first capital of the Confederate States of America will be held in Montgomery, Alabama. Later, when Virginia secedes, it will be in Richmond, Virginia. So here he is. So President of Confederate States of America from 1860 to 1865 is Jefferson Davis. He had a difficult time trying to execute a government that was born out of states' rights. So unlike Lincoln, he's going to have a really difficult time because, again, right, it is founded on the idea of rebellion. And so it's going to be really difficult for him as an executive to tell states that have left a union because of too much executive or legislative power what to do. There's a guy, his name is Senator John Crittenden, in the spirit of Henry Clay of Kentucky, right? He tries to come up with a compromise to save the Union. It's known as the Crittenden Compromise. He proposes it in 1860 to try to keep the South from leaving. What it offered is it offered a constitutional amendment to prevent civil war. It would have essentially allowed slavery to continue to exist. And so it is eventually defeated by the Republicans in Congress, and so we are not going to be able to avoid secession.